everybody, welcome back to Iron Culture. It is me, Eric Trexler, and I am joined by the Dr. Eric Helms with a very tiny spoon. Helms, how are you doing tonight?
You know me, I got Greek yogurt and a tiny spoon, and I'm annoyingly obsessed with food, so I couldn't be happier.
Awesome. Is that a newish development, the ramped up food obsession?
No, I mean, I don't deal with a ton of like hunger or food pangs, but I find that I am just far too attentive and interested in the flavors of things and care about food more than I generally care to be, because it's just not my normal personality. I notice the disparity, and I'm just tired of it. So I'm looking forward to getting a little bit fat, but
How long have you
not
been
before I compete.
wrestling with that?
Maybe once I got under like 190 pounds, then it's just kind of like steadily as I get leaner and leaner. So
Yeah.
maybe 3 months, 4 months.
Yeah. Well, you're near the
Yeah,
end, and there are more importantly fun things on the horizon. So you feeling ready for the for Worlds coming up in 1 week?
I posted a video of me flexing my uncle's bathroom in a speedo. The beauty of it's hilarious. When I check my Instagram stats, the day I do that, I see this big drop. Like all the people who follow me for like science communication, they're like, "What the fuck? Why is this guy in his underwear?" Pardon my French. But then like all like the hardcore bodybuilders who see it over the next couple days, then it trickles up. So it's funny. Like in this competition season, the last 3 months, I have like the most erratic, swings and follows. Like I have more views of my profile than ever before, but my follows are actually down slightly. So I have like minus 60, and then 3 days of plus 30.
So people
So it'll
people will
be
be
like,
so
yeah,
jarred by your uh, unsolicited nudity that they will actually unfollow.
yes. Despite the fact that I keep my profile picture as me in competition shape.
Yeah, people do not know
But
what they're getting into there. Well,
no, there it is.
so Helms, I have
But
a
but anyway,
couple.
sorry, I brought that up.
Yeah,
You asked me a question, how are things on the horizon, and I said I lose followers, and then we just moved along. I posted it because I achieved this morning the kind of conditioning that I had been envisioning this whole season, and I do think it is actually the leanest I've ever been, and it was a level of like graininess and crispiness that I wanted to post. Like I could probably maybe have slightly deeper grooves in like my upper glutes, and I'm sure I'll be focused on that my next season. But I had a sense of satisfaction and calm, and like, all right, that is what I was thinking of. I wanted to look like some type of strange alien, and we've done it. And now we're just trying to ride this look. So I'm basically sitting around maintenance with a very low fat and very high carb intake and, until game day, and then we're just topping off the gas tank. So it's a good feeling to know like we're there, we're done.
yeah.
Let's just maintain this look.
And you mentioned you were going to do another little push to the end there. Did that end up being fruitful, or did you pull the cord on it?
No, it was very fruitful. I ran 2 low days, one moderate day, and then I ran 3 low days, and then I had 2 high days over the weekend. And this morning was the day after the 2 high days, and there was no spill. I was just, in fact, I'm a little bit, but I think that's more so because the video was dehydrated, no pump this first thing in the morning.
Yeah.
So I worked out today on lateral raises, and I went. So I think we're good to go.
Nice. Well, I'm glad to hear it. I'm sure the whole Iron culture is wishing you luck this weekend. You're going to be at Worlds. Berto is going to be at Worlds. Anyone else that we would know of?
Brad Loomis is going to be at Worlds. Jeff is going to be coaching us at Worlds. There's a tremendous number of people competing. Unfortunately, this just got posted. Babacar Niang, or Niang Babacar, the reigning world champion, he lives in Italy, and he was not able to get his visa on time to compete. So he is not going to be there. No offense to any other competitor, and certainly it's not a complete write off, but I would say there's like a 70% chance if he shows up, he's winning the Worlds.
Yeah.
Although there's some really good people coming in, so it's kind of wide open right now. I think we're going to see a new WNBF World Champion crowned, and there's some really good folks in every single division coming in the pros, which is going to be exciting.
Nice. Well, we will look forward to the show recap. Like I said, wishing you luck. And Helms, I have a couple minor updates on my end before we get into the real meat of the show. Not really updates, but things relevant to the show that are worth acknowledging. So first of all, related to a couple prior episodes, we talked a little bit about what is a PhD, what goes into it, what do they look like, all these different structures, who decides when you get one, what does it mean once you've got it, all these things, right? I was targeted today, Helms, by an advertisement, or in America, as we call it, an advertisement. This was on Instagram.
I've heard of those.
And the advertisement said, and this, I wanted to immediately share it with the whole fitness world and just watch chaos ensue. The text on it was a photo of a person graduating, wearing the gown and the cap and whatnot. And the text on the advertisement says, all about no dissertation, 1 year doctoral programs. And I was like, man, if we had one of those in strength and conditioning or exercise science, could you imagine just everyone would be tearing everyone apart, limb from limb, attacking their credentials. Oh my God. So yeah, apparently folks out there, you can get a 1 year doctorate with no dissertation component whatsoever.
Nice.
What makes it a doctorate? I can't possibly say, but
it's accredited by whatever that advertisement is. Probably not accredited.
Yep. I don't think you're probably going to be able to apply any federally backed loans for this kind of program. It's probably going to be an out of pocket. They might actually make you pay with a cashier's check, if I had to guess.
I bet you Fannie and Freddie will take your money.
Oh, sure.
They
Absolutely.
always will.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But I saw that and I was like, oh man, this is too good with all the chaos and exercise science. The other thing,
you can get a 1 year master's exercise science or strength conditioning accelerated degree if you do it through the summer. It's maybe like 14 months and no dissertation.
No, I mean,
or no thesis. That's a thing.
No, so I was aware of those, right? Like I knew that those existed, and frankly, if you're doing a classes only heavy course load plus over the summer, plus it's accelerated, and there's no internship component, there's no practical component, there's no research component. Sure, why shouldn't you be able to do a really focused accelerated master's in a calendar year or 14 months, right? I don't find that to be out of the ordinary, especially if you're coming in with all sorts of prerequisites that are relevant to the field and things like that. But a doctoral degree is supposed to mean something and have a little
terminal degree.
It's supposed to have a little bit of weight to it. So yeah, I thought that was a little silly. But speaking of silly, Helms, another funny, cynical, sarcastic update on my end. Helms, as you know, if you've read any of our unpublished mass work that'll be coming out December 1st, I found yet another terrible meta-analysis that required substantial naming and shaming. It was quite bad. Actually, a mass reader sent it to me, so I appreciate them. They're like, you should cover this, and I was like, boy, will I. But
shout out to mass readers, by the way.
Huge shout out to mass readers. Yeah, you kind of became a cyborg there on my end with your internet feed, but I think you said shout out to mass readers, right?
I did.
Okay, cool. Yeah, you're back to normal. No, huge shout out to mass readers. It is awesome. It's very fulfilling and gratifying, I think, when members of the mass community are clearly showing that they're picking up stuff. I don't want to take all the credit for this person's intellect and their good eye or anything like that, but it is gratifying when people seem to be learning stuff from mass, applying it out there in the world, looking for research, and more so than that, identifying research that warrants additional scrutiny and kind of sending it our way. That to me is, I like to convince myself that by being a mass reader, they are more equipped to do that than they used to be. Could I be wrong? Sure. But I'd like to believe that. I have to believe it.
I think
It's what I
Trex,
need in my life.
not only do you need it, and therefore you should do it, but I think it's also a very justifiable, reasonable belief, considering you've not only written a how to interpret research, but a how to interpret stats guide, and specifically an article specifically on how to figure out if a meta-analysis was done well
Yes.
and what are the key things to look for. So you've produced the content for mass, and someone in mass said, "Hey, I found a meta-analysis with these issues." It's not an unreasonable assumption. I'll
Yeah.
back you.
But Helms, as you know, it wasn't just the issues we've talked about previously. This one had some special issues up its sleeve, which was really
Oh,
chaotic and just
good.
really bad. So, Helms, my little update here is I actually submitted a correspondence letter to the editor type thing
Oh,
where I sent it
you
to the
didn't just keep it in mass.
no, so I sent it to the journal. I said, this is really bad. You got to do something about this. And this is something I've done before. I've published a few of these little letters to the editor, and they usually I don't publish them unless they're fact, unless it's just like if math still
Big deal.
exists, my arguments are true, and so they virtually always come with some kind of correction or retraction or clarification. So I sent this in, and it's in a journal that is published by Springer Nature, which is a big publishing
Big
conglomerate,
deal.
which was Nature, which publishes, believe it or not, Holmes, the journal Nature, which most people would say is one of the top two journals in the world. I mean, number one or number two, Science and Nature, right?
Science or nature.
Yeah.
Yep.
So this is the elite top tier prestige in terms of publishers. This paper wasn't published in Nature itself, but the reason I bring up the publisher is because I sent in this letter to the editor. I was like, hey, here's an extensive. I extracted the data and I analyzed it three different ways because it seems like this author claims to have analyzed it this way, but they didn't. And they must have done it two separate ways to get the results that they did without reporting any of these deviations from their protocol. Um, so anyway, it's a very thorough analysis, very extensive. And they came back to me and said, well, if you want us to consider essentially this correspondence or this letter, you need to pay us $3,000, or you need to promise you'll be on the hook for this $3,000 if we publish it for an open access charge. And I was like, no reputable journal charges article processing charges for these types of direct
Corrections.
responses to completely botched papers. And they're like, I've been pushing back. I must have messaged them and emailed with them at this point 10 times. And they're saying, no, if you want to be the person, basically they have the concept of math. If you can imagine, like in a film, math, they have in a headlock with a knife up to its throat. And they're saying, fork over the $3,000 or math gets it. Math is done.
Okay, this isn't funny, Trex. I'm actually mad
I'm mad
because
too. Believe
I
me.
know you're mad, but you're far too laid back about this. They're literally saying we can't do letters to the editor, corrections, core addendums. We can't do the scientific process unless you pay me.
Yes.
And then we will not engage in it. And then, by the way, what we will be engaging in will be the experience you had last time of it barely will have an impact. I actually think this is something where we should contact like Retraction Watch and be like, hey, this journal is saying we got to pay 3,000. I've you notice I'm on board with you now. It's we.
Yeah.
I've joined the fight
Yeah.
because I'm angry.
Helms et
All the
al. Are
work that
being
I've
asked
done
to.
on this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you're aware of this. By the way, I'll use my funding. We'll pay the 3K, but I get to be first author.
Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding. So I honestly think you should go to. We should make stink about this because this is
Yeah.
unreasonable, and I think anyone in any field interdisciplinary who believes in any shred of hope for the peer-reviewed process would look at this and be like, this is an egregious issue. If a reputable publisher is saying you got to pay to play for like correcting the record. Like
Yeah.
this is the way science is supposed to work. We've accepted that we have a leech called publishing companies on us that is more parasite than symbiote, but at least it's currently doing something. But no, this is
Yeah.
just straight up. No, I think I'm just gonna suck your blood.
Yeah. I may have in one of my messages called it extortion, but anyway, No, so Helms, just to like, so everyone, what I said about math basically being rejected until I cough up money. In this paper, they have a confidence interval for an effect that ranges from, I believe it's negative 0.56 to like positive 0.50. So we're talking about an effect that is perfectly centered on zero, just
Mm-hmm.
absolutely straddling it perfectly, and they reported it as a value which is significantly different from zero. Um,
Mm.
so if you calculate the actual p-value, which they reported as less than 0.05, it's over zero point 0.9. I think it's actually over 0.95. It is as far away from being significant as you could really hope to get with real data. And so until I pay $3,000, my opinion on that mathematics is not being considered or taken seriously.
Now, I've heard of a statistical test where you take the positive value of the upper side of the confidence interval and you subtract the absolute value of the lower side of the confidence interval, and you report that as a p-value. And in that case, this would actually straddle exactly 0.05. That's called the Helmsian bullshit correction factor. I just
Yeah,
made it up.
I actually I don't know what exactly happened here. I'm not gonna share names. I'm not gonna share institutions or anything like that. But I have talked to someone who was working with a postdoc in their lab who was trained in a very different context, and they were working and talking shop and whatever, and the individual was just putting asterisks on their figure for this paper that was about to be published, you know, zero point zero 0.05, and he was like, what test did you run? That asterisk that you just placed on that figure, what test is that based on? You know, statistical test. And he said, "Oh no, when you want to bring attention to something, you put one of these stars by it and you say p is less than 0.05." So they had, this was a postdoc. They had no idea that the indicators of significance indicated a statistical test was done, that the p minus 0.05 relates to the p value from that test. They're like, no, it's just like when you want to, like, from an editorial perspective, highlight noteworthy things, you just plop that there. So part of
I
me
see what happened,
wonders,
Trex.
yeah, part of me
They got
wonders,
that 1 year doctorate,
yes, yeah, they got the
and now
one
they're
year,
doing their postdoc. That's all that is.
yeah, 1 year doctorate, 1 semester postdoc, and now you're running the show.
Ready to
Um,
rock.
but anyway, I have no idea how that p value happened. But the reason I brought this all up, Helms, is even more stark and sobering commentary about academic publishing is, in the process of me fighting this and fighting this and fighting this, they keep asking me to submit a letter to say, like, from like an actual administrator at my university, to verify that I did not receive grant funding specifically to write this letter to the editor, which is the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my entire life. That makes absolutely no sense. Uh, but anyway, so I said, fine, I will do it as I fight you on this every day. And so I got I emailed the administrator. I said, here's what's going on. Here's what I'm trying to do. Here's what I need the letter to say. Um, and an administrator stopped by my office today, Helms, as I was diligently working at my computer. And the reason they stopped by was they were concerned that, based on the information I was providing them, that I was potentially the victim of a fraudulent scam. I and I'm not
Which is
and
fair.
I'm not joking or embellishing at all. They basically came by and said,
That's amazing.
we're not being skeptical of you, Eric. We just think you're a dope who is walking into a fraudulent scam, and we would like to make sure you're protecting yourself. And I said, first of all, you're correct. This is a fraudulent scam. It's also how science works now. Um, and the administrator, after I showed them, like, here's the publisher, here's what they said, they were, they kind of chuckled, they were kind of dumbfounded, and they were kind of just like, wow, this is heavy. Like, I didn't know it had gotten this bad. So yeah, we are officially at the point with scientific publishing where literal administrators are flagging my requests as fraud. And it's just, this is
Yeah,
just how journals work now, which is
we're in the Nigerian prince phase
exactly.
of dealing with science, bro. This is
Yeah.
it's awful. I mean, I am I'm flabbergasted and angry. This is I mean, I guess we are talking about this publicly. This is going to get listened to by 8 or 9 thousand people. So
Yeah. Yeah, I will. So you were saying like, hey, we should actually shine a light on this. I plan to, but I also, because it's
I had to.
so ridiculous, I assume this is going to work itself out. Just because it kind of has to. Like, again, like for the apple cider vinegar letter to the editor, that took 2 years of effort. It took, I think, 12 emails to get the waiver for the article processing charges. But at a certain point, you just sit them down and say, like, so now that I've informed you that you published false statements, are you insisting on keep continuing to have those false statements published? And if you start talking with like increasingly litigious tone, they start to say, oh, I think we might actually be a fraudulent enterprise if we don't actually consider this feedback. So I'm sure this will,
Trex,
yeah,
this might actually be a second order effect of something I just remembered that happened to me and one of my students about a year and a half ago. Um, that is also not quite this bad, but similarly ridiculous. It's more of a result of incentivizing the publisher parish environment. So I've had two students now who have had letters to the editor about one of their publications where the letter to the editor is basically like, we really like this paper. It's like 2 paragraphs because they're super short. It's like a 750 word limit. And they basically just say nothing. And there's
yeah,
no critique, there's no request to change anything. And you come to find out, you track back the country they're from and the university, and it is a heavily publisher parish reward based system, and they actually get funding based upon the number of publications they have. And you find out the reason they did it in this specific journal is because it doesn't have peer review and it doesn't do those things because that's a reasonable thing to do. If someone has a letter to the editor, we should let it through. So it is possible that what you're experiencing is because of the second order effect of a cottage industry from universities emphasizing publications without any emphasis on quality, and then universities who are trying to make ends meet and they're struggling postdocs going, listen, I'm too busy writing a grant to pay myself to write a grant to have time to actually do research. So all I'm going to do is find a random paper in X journal and write a 750 word thing through ChatGPT that says, great job, I like science. It'll get published without getting looked at because the editors are also other academics that don't have time to do it, and it's all automated anyway. And the publishers don't really do anything. And then some other legitimate publisher like Nature goes, well, we got to stop that. Oh, no problem. We just need to double check that they haven't received grant funding for it or any reward and also make them pay the publishing fee. And here we are in
yeah.
this terrible. I'm,
Sorry, you froze up
is
a
this
little
our
bit.
fault?
You froze up a little there. I couldn't
I,
hear
I
you.
said I said maybe we did something bad in a prior life. Is that
Yeah,
is that what's happening? Are we in purgatory?
it could be. Yeah, but I do. I think this will all get sorted out because it's just too it's too ridiculous to not. But if it doesn't, then yeah, we'll sound all the alarms and run it through all the channels and get everybody whipped up into a frenzy. But I just wanted to briefly comment on the hilarity of now it's gotten to be such overtly fraudulent and so clearly scammy that now I'm actually setting off fraud detectors by just trying to publish a letter to the editor to try to correct a completely botched analysis, which is it's certainly a wild time, man. But anyway, Helms. By the way, folks, if you want to read the whole ordeal and see exactly how bad this paper is and how to protect yourself from falling for these kind of papers in the future, that'll be coming out in the Mass Research Review December 1st. While we're on that, let's do the whole thing. So, folks, if you like the show and you want to support it, there's a lot of ways to do it, and we would appreciate all of them. Like, rate, subscribe, review, tell a friend, share it with people. If you really want to get your fingerprints on the show, you can show up in the live chat to ask us a question. You can submit a question in the After Hours portal at massresearchreview.com/ironculture. And then, of course, if you want to be a top tier, number one elite winner circle supporter, of course, you can go to massresearchreview.com and learn a little bit more and even become a member of the mass community. Every single month, the first of the month, we publish an update on the newest research in exercise, nutrition, strength sport, and all related topics so you can stay on top of your game, get the best results for you and your clients. And then finally, we need to support our
Speaking of
friends.
elite,
Absolutely. We need to
yes,
support our
there it
friends at
is.
Elite
You're all over it.
FTS who support us. If you are in the market for absolutely high quality gym gear or gym apparel, make sure you head over to elitefts.com. Use our discount code, which is MRR10. That stands for Mass Research Review 10. It'll get you 10% off your order. And Elite FTS, they make, and I say this very honestly, with full transparency, I have shared on this show before. I got a pair of lifting straps from Elite FTS. These are the ones I used in college when you would put on irresponsible weight and do 650-pound rack pulls and deadlift more than you probably ought to be deadlifting, and you'd throw them in your gym bag and beat them up and all that stuff. And they still are completely functional and in great shape. I actually, at the time, bought two pairs. I was just looking through my storage the other day. I bought two pairs because I said, well, these look really nice, and I'll wear through the first pair, then move on to the second pair. The second pair is still untouched. So I have the pair to prove it, Helms. So Elite FTS, very high quality gear. They've got your straps, they've got your wrist wraps, they've got your bands, you name it, they got it. We good to move on, Helms?
Yeah, man, well done. You nailed it, and couldn't agree more. Elite FTS is the best.
Awesome. I fully endorse that perspective. So let's I want to run a question by you here. This isn't like necessarily a direct listener question, but it is something that I think you'll have feelings about. Probably a strong perspective. I was perusing the internet and I saw a comment, a post that made the following statement: systemic fatigue is mental fatigue. Full stop. And I thought it would be interesting to have maybe just a brief little chat about this whole concept of systemic fatigue as a lifter. I remember when I was coming up, this was a topic that was all over the place. When I really started to get into lifting, 2009 to 2012 ish, I was really ramping up my lifting. A lot of people were talking about this concept of systemic fatigue. You do heavy stuff, especially things like squats or deadlifts, and you vaguely accumulate this thing, which is called systemic fatigue. It's not related to
Or
the muscle
central fatigue.
or central fatigue. Yeah, the idea is it's this kind of top-down, brain to periphery, central nervous system kind of down regulation where it's like, nope, you used up all of your strength and effort tokens, and now when you tell muscle to turn on, it's not going to do it very well, or it won't produce the same level of force you were hoping it would. And I think, systemic fatigue, you'll hear people talk about this when they say, well, you really shouldn't train more than 6 weeks in a row heavy because you'll accumulate systemic fatigue or central fatigue, and then you need to deload for 1 week to wipe that slate clean. What is the evidence that 1 week is the correct amount, and what is the dose of deloading to do that? We have literally no idea. But anyway, I wanted to get your take on this idea of systemic fatigue or central fatigue, how much time you spend thinking about it in programming, and how much you think is a legitimate physiological phenomenon versus just kind of mental fatigue or even just staleness.
This is, I have to be careful to not go down the rabbit hole, but I think the framing of fatigue, it's one of those things where you can start with a heuristic, and then the more and more and more you drill down, you actually realize we don't know quite as much as we think we know. In much the same way that we talk about mechanical overload being the stimulus, or mechanical tension being the stimulus for hypertrophy, and you go, okay, well then how does that work? And then you get to the next step, and the next step, and the next step, and then you realize there's multiple different forms of mechanical tension. There's actually downstream and upstream regulators. The mechanical sensors are not all the same, and there's a lot we have left to learn. And there are mTOR and even non-mTOR dependent pathways that these things might eventually simulate, and then they get modified by things that, potentially metabolic stress, maybe not, etc., hormones, and it's the surface level Dunning-Kruger kind of interpretation. It's not wrong, but it's not complete. So we'll start with the basics. Fatigue is something that we talk about colloquially, and we all kind of know what we mean. Like, I feel fatigued, I feel tired. And it is collective, it encompasses a lot of things. And people are happy to throw, like mechanisms at it because they know what the experience is, and it doesn't really matter. So you might hear some Olympics commentator from 10 years ago say, the lactic acid, and that's probably not what's causing you to be fatigued 2 days later, right? And it probably isn't even the thing that's actually causing the fatigue. That's probably has more to do with other ions and things like that acutely. So I think it's useful to state that in sports science, we describe fatigue as an outcome. That when you are in a state of fatigue, your performance is decreased. And it's agnostic in most definitions to the cause. So when someone says systemic fatigue is mental fatigue, we have to really break that sentence down. Systemic means that you're experiencing fatigue to multiple systems. So this presumably would result in a decreased force output at various levels, and this would actually impact strength, endurance, aerobic effects, coordination, the whole 9 yards. And mental fatigue could do that. But ultimately, systemic fatigue just means it's affecting multiple systems. And then we have to go, all right, are we talking about systemic fatigue, or what do you mean? And one term that is often used by powerlifters or strength athletes, exists in science, but aren't the same thing, is central fatigue. So you'll often hear people talk about central versus peripheral fatigue, which in strength conditioning circles are more or less proxies for like muscle damage and glycogen depletion and nervous system fatigue, central nervous system fatigue from lifting heavy. And in the research, however, peripheral fatigue does roughly map onto that, as well as some other things, and there's time course dependent issues there. But central fatigue is actually something you can measure with specific techniques in a neuromuscular lab setting. I've never done this. I have seen it done, and I am aware of the techniques. And Trex, if you want to jump in if I misrepresent anything, please do. But the idea is that you get a voluntary contraction strength out of someone, and then you can actually stimulate the nerve, and then depending upon where you stimulate it, you can see, oh, we were able to get more out of them from what they were voluntarily doing. So there's some central issue because the peripheral nerve is able to produce this extra force. And then we can actually quantify the amount of central fatigue. And typically the central fatigue is something that, at least the way we measure it in the settings we do with the type of interventions that cause fatigue, is a pretty temporary phenomenon. And it goes away quick. And it is, can reduce your force output right now. And it has been linked to various things. However, there are some links to peripheral fatigue causing central fatigue and peripheral fatigue causing other things which interfere with performance. So, as an example, muscle damage in and of itself will prevent specific myofibers from contracting because you can look at it at a microscope and be like, that fiber ain't going to contract because look at that. It's not even attached to the cytoskeleton right there. That's going to need to be cleaned up by some calpain and removed and then replaced, right? There's that. But there is also this seeming effect where if there is sufficient muscle damage, that can lead to central fatigue. And then even if the muscle fiber itself isn't experiencing Z-line streaming, you can get what's called excitation contraction coupling failure, or EC coupling failure. You may see people talk about this, and this can be from exercise-induced muscle damage, or it can be from an overload of calcium ions. So you can get enzymes called calplanes that degrade proteins in the EC coupling system, which is a very small, it's not like you're not seeing the full Z-line streaming, but basically what you're getting is from repeated contractions and the metabolic byproducts of contraction. And there is even some muscle damage from pure concentric. It just takes a lot of volume of this to produce enough of these. You can get temporary EC coupling failure from having produced a lot of force and done a lot of work, and that will require some repair and recovery. So there's a huge intermingling here. And the ability to handle calcium and produce contraction is interfered with by a lot of things. You and I both know that, like when glycogen is depleted, mechanistically, you can see some contraction issues that leads to some of this. And we often think like, oh, glycogen depletion, that's just an energy system issue. We can't produce ATP fast enough. But when you're seeing glycogen depletion leading to resistance training performance issues, it probably has more to do with calcium handling than it just is a lack of ability to generate ATP. And also, the experience and what happens to people when they are very low in glycogen or they're having muscle damage, it is central and it's peripheral. You experience mental fatigue in these states. Bonking, this kind of connects to, it's not a perfect model or theory, but it is close enough to others, like the central governor idea, that basically we have, I don't think it's just like this machine in our head that is doing this, but our system is one which protects our ability to do specifically high intensity and high force production outputs, because that's the thing that's really going to save our ass from a evolutionary perspective. You may not be able to run, the same mile pace, but if you need to almost at any time, unless you are truly fatigued and beat up and at the end of your rope, climb a tree real quick, because that's what we needed to be here today at certain times of our evolution. So anyway, all that is to say that the central governor idea is that we're sensing all of these different sources of potential fatigue, and from acute changes in pH in the muscle and buildup of metabolites to glycogen depletion to calcium handling to EC coupling failure to actual structural muscle damage that you can see from Z-line streaming, that results in your body throttling back, right? I'm not going to allow you to push this hard, which you experience as mental fatigue or just general fatigue. And then we try to describe all these things, and certain things affect others. So when a power lifter is going, I'm not strong today, but I don't feel sore and I just feel in a rut, it is some collection of these factors that we don't quite understand, but they may or may not, if you took them to a lab and tested their central fatigue, actually on an MVIC test, be able to produce more force than that decrement. So some people have gotten really hung up on that. They're like, that's not central fatigue. And we go, well, I don't know what it is, but I'm not strong today. And I think ultimately you can take a step back all the way to the sports science definition of fatigue and say, for whatever reason, because of the work I've put in, through any combination of all these factors, my performance is down. And then the question is, what do you do about it? And to the extent that which it might be helpful to understand the source of that, you can dig down into it. Now, if you're cripplingly sore and you did sets of, 12 to failure on a long muscle length exercise, that's a little different than I did a bunch of heavy singles, maybe 3 or 4. Probably didn't experience muscle damage, but I'm not strong and I don't know why. But I think it's probably a stretch to say it's mental fatigue or it's psychological, because it gives the impression you can think or will your way out of it. And I'm not sure you can. And that is a perennial issue we have, especially with Western original conceptions of medicine, where the mind is separate from the body, in which it is truly not. And I think we do need to get away from that. So the idea that we're just sandbagging it, or if you had better grit, et cetera, I think it's not useful. And we do have a tendency to, whenever we don't know the cause of something, we shift it to the thing that we think it could be. So, for example, one of the things I don't agree with in the debate around whether or not hypertrophy contributes to strength is, among some of the people who believe that hypertrophy was not a major contributor to strength, they would go, well, how do people get stronger over time? They go, oh, they're just making more neuromuscular adaptations. And it basically, that hasn't been measured, hasn't been proven, but it just basically oversimplifies strength as neuromuscular hypertrophy, which is a heuristic that, like all models, is wrong at some point. And we're having this kind of in-depth, nuanced conversation about strength that probably is wrong, or at least we know it is insufficiently proven to claim it is right. So I think to say this is akin to that. We don't know the source of fatigue. but we can't just say that it's mental.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth noting, when you look at the mental fatigue literature, which Zordos has done a really great job covering in mass in recent years. The other thing with mental fatigue is that there is kind of a big misnomer, which is that the path to alleviating mental fatigue is to kind of tough it out, and mental fatigue, again, much like you were saying with like kind of what we in the scientific literature view or conceptualize as central fatigue, mental fatigue does tend to be this kind of short-lived, kind of acute onset response that can also be dissipated, but not by, necessarily toughing it out, but by actually going the opposite route and doing a little bit of relaxation, right? So there have been studies of, when people do something that's mentally fatiguing, whether it's kind of like scrolling social media and a lot of sensory inputs as they're kind of scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, or doing some kind of challenging puzzles or math problems, we will see some of these acute performance decrements, which seem to be driven by this very cognitively sourced state of fatigue. But by just kind of doing, something like a mindfulness exercise or taking a little mini nap or even just kind of resting and disconnecting from all the stimuli, it seems like we have the ability to actually kind of clear out and alleviate that stuff in the short term. Like it's not a deload, it's a, hey, why don't you go like chill and like just kind of rest your eyes for 15 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thing. So, whenever I hear about these questions about central fatigue, systemic fatigue, it naturally wraps into discussions about deloading, discussions about overtraining. Because that used to always be a thing in lifting, right? Was that, well, when you're noticing
Yeah.
central or systemic fatigues, that's when you've overtrained, and the antidote is a deload. And like you said, there's a lot of I don't want to like come out and forcefully assert uh, things that are not known about central fatigue, but that whole line of thinking was really sold, if you go back like 10 years ago, as a pretty established perspective, right? And what you when you dive into the literature, I think a lot of people, especially at that time, who got into the more evidence-based approach and started to actually dig into literature rather than following content creators who are supposed to be in the literature, a lot of people were really stunned to find out, whoa, there's like no evidence that actually kind of corroborates this very clean picture of, too much deadlifting causes this accumulation of central or systemic fatigue, which manifests as
Yeah.
overtraining, which is cured by a deload, which conveniently happens to be the dose is always 7 days, right? Like that stuff was all kind of like
Yeah.
taking this vague set of like notions and experiences and related concepts and kind of putting them into a cohesive narrative that seemed to make sense and, more importantly, seemed to practically work in practice, right? And so again, it's that balance of saying, well, from it, like if you were Helms, not being pragmatic. You were just Eric Helms, the esteemed reviewer for a journal by Springer Nature, and the $3,000 check cleared. So you're going to bother to actually review this paper. And they lay out that line of
Mm-hmm.
argument. You go, no, absolutely not. You cannot,
Yeah.
in a peer reviewed paper, state as a matter of fact that is the sequence of events, because there's no research that you've cited to. There's no research you could cite to actually really make that argument in a convincing way. However,
Yeah.
on the other hand, if you're not being the stingy reviewer who requires that high burden of evidence, and instead you're Helms the coach who's trying to be useful and pragmatic and helpful, you would say, well, I don't know. I have had programs where I really, really pushed high volume, high frequency, high load, high everything, right? More of everything. And I sure felt like crap after a certain number of days. And it wasn't just, um, I'm bored of my program. It wasn't just I'm sore. I felt like crap, and so we don't really understand that phenomenon very well yet. We certainly don't have the whole library of PubMed citations to very accurately and concisely put together the whole story. But this is one of the reasons, Helms, when we look at how messy this is, and I think you did a good job summarizing the messiness. This is one of the reasons that when I approached deloads when I was coaching, I did not I didn't fool myself or trick myself into believing it was really all that simple. And when you break out of when you liberate yourself from that kind of really rigid and relatively unsubstantiated narrative, you broaden your horizons in terms of how can I help this client or help myself if you're the fatigued person in a very comprehensive way. And so I would have clients with
Yep.
deloads who I would say, well, based on what we know with how relative energy deficiency can manifest, maybe during this deload I also want to be very intentional about making sure that you're eating enough. And maybe during this deload, I want to be very
Mm-hmm.
intentional about making sure that you are getting adequate sleep and maybe even napping. And maybe even before we decide it's time for deload, I actually implement for you an instruction to mentally unwind before you train. An actual dedicated 15-minute
Yep.
period where we're saying no phone. If you want to convince yourself that we're doing something more productive, stretch or do a dynamic warm up that you don't normally do. Let's really take some time to try to mentally decompress to see if that might be contributing here. Another thing is during the deload, I used to not really get too caught up in the I need you to drop volume by exactly 40%, or I need you to drop your intensity by exactly 55%. What I would usually do is say we generally want to make things a little easier. We also want to kind of just switch things up a little bit. And most importantly, to the extent that mental staleness, which is different than mental fatigue in my book, but to the extent that mental staleness might be contributing, I actually want you to go in and have some fun workouts. And so, what that would look like on my end, and this is very unconventional, I wouldn't fault someone for saying, Eric, you're a hack and you're an idiot and you're full of crap. But I never, as a coach, I always felt an obligation back when I had a client roster and was actively coaching. I felt an obligation to have a damn good justification and reason for things I recommend, but I did not feel obligated to have a PubMed citation for everything I did. You know what I mean? Those are two very different
Yep.
things. And so when it came to designing deloads that were also mindful of the potential ramifications of just staleness, I would tell them, I want you to go in and have a fun week in the gym. And so if
Yes.
it's for my people who they kind of came up on a more like bro split kind of training, chasing the pump, but now they do more, stuff that's a little bit more aligned with the evidence relative to their goals, I might say, hey, I don't want you to like go overboard with the volume, maybe cut it back a little bit, but just go in and have a good old fashioned chest day. Go in there and have an arm day. Like let's go chase a pump.
Mm-hmm.
Let's do a bodybuilding split for a day. We're going to drop a bunch of different, frequency and volume metrics and intensity metrics in the process. But go have a fun bro week where you're just doing your thing. I had a client who was, it was really interesting because she started out as a CrossFitter and said, I want to get into powerlifting. And she had a lot of aptitude for powerlifting. She was very good, and she was making really big strides. And I was her first coach in that transition of make me a powerlifter out of a
Mm-hmm.
CrossFitter. And there was no question she still had a lot of love for CrossFit. And so her deloads would be CrossFit weeks. I'd say go in there and have fun, do the stuff, do the movements, arrange the workouts the way you miss them being for fun. And what we found was there's kind of a good balance where if every seventh or eighth week we just threw in a CrossFit week, it was enough to scratch that itch, and she would find more joy in her powerlifting training because she didn't feel like she was totally separated from that other type of training. Um, so all
Mm-hmm.
that is to say, I think when you acknowledge the complexity of what we colloquially refer to as central fatigue or systemic fatigue, I think we should shy away from, like you said, making definitive, overly simplified statements about this is what it is. Um, but we should embrace that complexity. And if you do embrace that complexity, what that means is you actually have a lot more levers to mess with on a deload than just cut volume or cut intensity. So, do you
Mm-hmm.
think I've harpooned my credibility in divulging this? And have you ever done similar things with clients?
I know and yes, and I think to kind of bridge the Eric Helms peer reviewer who's paid his $3,000 and Eric Helms, the coach, I think something I realized a while back, actually it was in writing my second or my third edition of the books, was that the experience of fatigue, even though we don't feel like we can fully explain it, it's it's because most attempts to do so have been overly reductionist, and because sports science started um, with a lot of endurance athletes pushing to extreme limits to where things did become a little more predictable. It's like one type of performance, you go until you can't move. Overtraining does sometimes happen, and we've measured it. And then it was just kind of like applied to strength conditioning, and then strength conditioning was kind of applied to like people lifting weights 3 times a week. So
Yeah.
um, the something I have gotten away from a lot is the idea of having scheduled deloads and that they need to follow this certain pattern. Because when I really think about it, the average person who reads my content is training 4 hours per week,
Yeah.
and I'm like, I just, and like when I'm sitting in a setting with world class powerlifters, or when you're talking about me doing to compete at the world level in bodybuilding, some of this stuff makes sense. Like, oh well, you're not training hard enough if you don't need a deload. Well, it's like training hard enough to what? Training hard enough to adapt is there's enough sufficient recovery for a resistance training specific adaptation to not be maximized, but to at least occur in even advanced lifters without ever needing a deload. But that doesn't mean that other things in your life won't interfere with that. That's the whole biopsychosocial model. That's like you said, sometimes I don't eat enough. Sometimes I get stuck in traffic. Sometimes I have all this other stuff going on. Sometimes I want to play basketball. So to kind of bring it back to what am I saying? Like there are four really, really good publications I think people should read. And if anyone is super nerd and they want to read this, for one, there's a great one by Zajac from 2015 called Central and Peripheral Fatigue During Resistance Exercise, a Critical Review. And it goes through basically everything we know about fatigue. It's about 10 years old, but it's still pretty good, that comes from resistance exercise specifically. Another really good one that gets right at the heart of this, that is very critical, that's more recent, is by Kataoka. I think Buckner is the senior author. I know he promoted this good. I really liked it, Sam Buckner's work. Is there evidence for the suggestion that fatigue accumulates following resistance exercise? And they kind of got to this point. They're like, listen, fatigue is real. It comes from a lot of places. It can last over different time courses. But this vague notion of fatigue might not be a thing, even if you are experiencing it. And I think that's a key thing because there are sources of fatigue that I summarized that occur within minutes, hours, a day, and up to a couple days, depending upon how much of a repeated bout effect you have. And they can overlap, follow a time course, be predicted, and a deload will help, right? So you can have that coaching experience that you and I have talked about, but that gets layered with the whole periodization literature being overly prescriptive and specific, and people thinking that they have to follow these 10 commandment like rules that will work if you do them, but it'll also work to roll down your window and climb into your car through the window, but you could have opened the door. Like you've made this harder than it needs to be. And I think that's where you and I connect on the deloads. So a lot of things, a lot of times with the clientele I work with, they really hate doing something like I went from 5x5 at a 9 RPE to 3x5 at a 5 RPE. They're like, why am I even in the gym? You know, so in a similar vein that you're like, let's go to a body part split and we'll indirectly reduce volume and frequency, but we'll still train hard and have fun. Sometimes I'll have people go from a 5 or 6 day split to coming in to train 3 days, and hitting at least each muscle group once, choosing exercises that they like and they want to do, but nothing that is once because I don't want to accidentally cause like novel training damage. But if they haven't done it in a little bit and it's like a more shortened biased exercise, like go for it. Like if you haven't done concentration curls in a while, but we've been doing preachers and behind the back curls, like it's not going to make you sore. Have fun. And then still train to failure, still do what they if they want to. So like I've tried to figure out like what gets you engaged to train. It's the same kind of thing with the body part split. We'll limit you on 3 to 4 days, which is like a 40 to 50% cut in volume, and go in there and blast it to the degree that you want to, And if you want to only train 2 days, that's fine too. So yeah, I think those two articles are really, really good. Another really good one is by Peak, muscle damage and inflammation during recovery from exercise, as well as Marcus, exercise-induced muscle damage mechanism assessment and nutritional factors to accelerate recovery, and that's in 2021. If you read those four, and because they're reviews, that's why I wanted to suggest these four, you'll have an understanding of how what we experience can fit into that narrative, but that there's many other ways for it to manifest, and sometimes you'd be like, oh well, only my squat felt like crap, but I was fine on a leg extension, or I couldn't run for 2 weeks, but I was still strong. If you're like a concurrent athlete or CrossFitter or something like that,
Yeah.
that it isn't just this all-encompassing experience. So no, I really like the idea of having these personalized, holistic approaches to deloading because of the fatigue being able to come from multiple. Even if it came from one source, it ends up having systemic effects, and because that's the nature of us being a system and trying to be too reductionist in this literature. Um, so yeah, that's my general perspective, but I think it is also just important to acknowledge that there there is a science to this, and you could like it's not like hand wavy. It's just that in practice we can't use all these multiple methods and look across them and figure out what's exactly going on and figure out what the perfect timeline is and what to do. But it is also true that pretty reliably, if you give someone a taper, which basically follows those tenets of deloading, they're probably going to be 3% stronger on average after that week, you know?
Yeah.
So this stuff works too, which is kind of why it's some coaches will push back. But I think it's important to understand that tapers and deloads in athletic settings are done in true states of fatigue of full-time athletes who are sometimes training 20 hours per week and have pushed themselves actually to their limits. And doing that's very different from your personal training client who wasn't strong on Thursday.
Yeah. Absolutely. So Helms, I tell you what, staying on theme, I think we got a couple questions that are related to fatigue related concepts, and I think that'll probably just about do it for this episode if that works for you. But yeah, I just
I'm
want
getting
to
a little fatigued by it, but all right.
I want to endorse your one of the big points there that you mentioned a few times, which is that it is I think sometimes people who don't have a lot of exposure to like elite sport, they really start to lose the context of all these strategies, all these worries, all these concerns, all these mitigating interventions that kind of leak out of elite sport, high level sport. It's like you got to understand that these folks are literally, they're in many cases they're training
Job.
6 hours a day most days, and so yeah, when
Mm-hmm.
you're putting in 4.5 hours a week, it's the magnitude, the scale of it is so different. And also you have to remember that the folks who are putting in those, sometimes up to 6 hours a day, they're also, because they've been doing that for a long time, putting their body through things that you don't necessarily have access to. You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
it's
Yep.
very different if someone goes in and says, "Oh boy, 4 heavy sets of squat today with 175." Well, if someone's moving 800 pounds on the bar, those are just fundamentally different stimuli when it comes to the total amount of accessible fatigue, right? So it
Yep.
is important to be mindful of, not trying to get too into kind of copycatting these high level strategies that are ultimately built for fundamentally different settings. And that is one of the reasons, just to kind of put a bow on this and wrap it up, that is one of the reasons that I would tend to gravitate toward more holistic approaches to deloading, is because I would notice in some of my clients, you don't have a massive training load issue. You have a
Mm-hmm.
kids aren't sleeping well, kind of stressed out at work. You got those
Poor recovery
issues, right?
environment.
Or you're not eating
Yeah.
enough, right? So I would try to get in there and say, let's rediscover some joy, because it's been a rough few weeks because of just stuff outside of the gym. Let's go have fun workouts. Let's try to do what we can to get some extra sleep. We can drop the training load a little bit, not because the training load was too high, but because all the other stuff made it such that we need to make some accommodations so we can just overall turn the volume down, turn the temperature down a little bit, so I don't mix my metaphor with my actual variable there. But yeah, so
Yep.
I would try to figure out ways how can we kind of assess what seems to be driving this to the extent it's possible. Can we use time during our deload to actually address the root of the problem? And if not, how do we change other things to accommodate this problem or this causative factor? I don't want to call it a problem. We don't want to get too in the habit of calling life a thing that gets in the way of our training.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, my problem
Well,
is
if your
that I have a
children get
job
in
and
the way of your
children.
training, you're
Yeah.
that's I mean that for me that's a problem.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah,
My job
you don't want
should
to tell the person
ideally
who's
be to train.
you don't tell the person who's a non-competitive lifter, like, if you just didn't have a job and a family, you'd be in a much better spot. I don't think that's really quite the case. But anyway, so Helms, we got two fatigue related questions. One of these, I'm going to be honest, I don't know anything about this. If you don't either, that's fine. We can move on. But I did get a
Okay.
question. So the question was, I don't know if people do this in the U.S. or New Zealand, but when I used to play rugby, people would use things like arnica creams or tiger balm. Have you heard of any of those, Helms?
Tiger Balm.
Yeah.
Tiger Balm is basically like a menthol cream. Yeah,
So
hot, like icy hot.
yeah, so okay, icy hot. It sounds like is a similar genre, but they would use it to
Yeah.
keep their muscles and joints quote unquote warm. People use it in the locker room either as like to get ready for competition or after competition. Is there any evidence that you're aware of that this is an effective strategy, or is this just a placebo effect?
I've never actively looked for evidence, and none has ever come across my desk, proverbially, or what's the other thing? Literally, um, in the time that I have been in sports science. I suspect if I did a Google, there might be something out there. But yeah, I mean, the cream that I do think probably makes sense is like Voltaren cream. We talked about that before. That's a topical ibuprofen which can locally impact the joint, and there's data on that. But
Yeah,
yeah, I think it does change sensation, and that can lead to you know either a placebo effect or actually possibly even a change in I could see like kind of the central governor esque thing happening. I mean, like that's like
yeah,
carb mouth rinsing. Your body thinks it has access to more carbohydrates, so it doesn't hold the brakes on you as much. I could see there being joint temperature related things that might impact, arthrokinetic inhibition. But I have no data to confirm that to be the case, but it wouldn't necessarily surprise me because certainly I noticed, like, for example, I need less warm up sets on heavy leg presses or squats if I wear knee sleeves.
right.
I don't think that's necessarily changing my physiology to any substantial degree. I think it changes my perception, which has a downstream impact on my experience, which probably changes my physiology.
Yeah. Now, Helms, I will say this: you are an advanced lifter with tremendously advanced age, and
This was true even 15 years ago, though.
yes, but you've been lifting hard in many different capacities. You've run into, I would imagine, just about every bump and bruise and tweak accessible to a lifter. Have you ever actually reached for one of these topical treatments? Like, have you ever
Yes,
sought one out?
I've tried it. Yeah. So when I was Olympic lifting, Voltaren creams and Tiger Balm equivalents were all over the place. And as you recall, I spent 3 years trying to not get bilateral FAI surgery.
Yeah,
And the experience of that was that I constantly had what felt like IT band pain,
yeah,
and I would get some lateral IT band pain down by the knee, and I would get like really tight in my like vastus lateralis, and squats used to just feel awful, and then they'd affect deadlifts, and so I was willing to try anything,
yeah,
you know. So they didn't help me, but I did like the change in sensation.
yeah,
Like I think I think sometimes when you are in constant pain, you'll accept a different flavor of the same intensity of pain just to be different.
yeah.
Um, we- you've been in chronic pain before. You know what I'm talking about. Like your lower back hurts, and then it shifts to the other side the next day, and you're like, oh, I mean that's not better,
Well,
but okay.
It's
I'm good with that.
change. And I mean,
Yeah,
when you have a chronic pain issue, especially if it's going on for a long time, change at least gives the illusion, even if it's a, again, not just like in any change that isn't an intensification of
bad.
the same, gives you the
Yeah,
perception or the perspective, maybe something will get different about this. Maybe there is a resolution on the
yeah.
horizon. Maybe, but no, I mean, I did get to the point, and this is actually interesting because because I had that chronic issue, which has been a lot better lately. But I was just talking to my parents about this. We were hanging out, and I was like, man, I used to, most nights of the week, I would wake up with this extreme nerve pain, uh, and it would be unilateral, but it would be weird because I would wake up with my hip in a flexed position, and I could feel this kind of a very burning kind of nerve pain in like my
Mm,
down my thigh, and I knew right now it's a 4 out of 10. But I have to resolve this. I cannot live the rest of my life with my hip inflection. And I knew when I extend my hip and get past a certain threshold for about 3 seconds, not immediate, this weird like 3 second runoff, it's going to be a 10 out of 10 or about as close to a 10 as I felt. And so then I would have to do this to myself, Helms. Like you choose
mm,
when is this going to happen, right? And so I would straighten my leg. It would spike to what I perceived as a 10 out of 10. And in some cases, I would actually, I was very self conscious about it because one time uh, I was in a bedroom with a person and I shouted. I couldn't control it.
yeah.
It was like, so it was so bad. And the reason I bring that up is the other day, I had that little tiny remnant of that feeling when I was sitting in this exact desk chair and but I was sitting, I wasn't in that lying position, so I knew I didn't have to go through the whole extension process and all that. So it was just about a 2 out of 10, but it was the same flavor and same area. But even that, like you were saying, Holmes, when you've been through chronic pain like that, you're like, oh, it wasn't when I was sleeping. It was a 2 out of 10 instead of this weird thing that spikes to a 10 out of 10. I'll take it. It is really weird the bargaining that you'll do with yourself when you're dealing with chronic pain. Condition or some kind of circumstances that are causing it. So I totally get what you're talking about of if I could
Hmm.
just have a slightly different pain sensation in some cases, you're like I'm good with that. That I'll make that
Yep.
work.
And that was what I got with Tiger Balm. I was like, oh, this is the same IT band pain, but I also have this menthol fresh, hot area feeling,
Yeah.
and I'm like, all right. And that was enough to, get me to do another set of five with like 90% of my max or some nonsense.
Yeah. And
It
you
was hard
vaguely
training.
smell like mint.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, I that's the extent of it though. I know I'm a little curious. I will probably spend some time tonight actually doing a Google for menthol based cream and strength conditioning or something like that.
Yeah. So let's wrap it up with one other thing related to fatigue here. So we had a question from Zag. It said, what is the bare minimum cardio protocol to get into bodybuilding shape? I get gassed out from supersetting buys and tries, and I want to get to a point where I have enough work capacity to superset chest and back no problem. I average 10,000 steps a day, but that's clearly not enough, and I need to do dedicated cardio. What's the least I can do and still get great work capacity?
Hmm. I would actually just first look to see what is your current rest times. Like actually see how long you're resting between sets on other things, and how much time you spend talking in the gym. And I would probably start working your rest periods down to about 2 minutes on non-compound exercises before going straight to supersets. Um, and if you can comfortably get through your uh, eventually machine-based upper body work, your isolation work for any body part with 2 minute rests, and then you're not seeing a big decrement in performance, and you're qualitatively feeling like you're good to go, I think that would do a lot. The other thing I would suggest is just try to pick up the pace on your 10,000 steps. Like just walk faster. Unless you're, walking with someone who's shorter or older or all those things. But um, I, one thing I really appreciate is my biggest walk that I go on every day is with my wife. And my step speed actually slows, and I can't always tell when I do it based upon how beat up I am from prep. But she likes to walk, and she walks quickly because she used to be a zookeeper for many years in Auckland Zoo. And there's two of the enclosures she worked at that were big, describing what they describe as a zookeeper walk. So trying to keep up with my wife, who is half a foot shorter than me, but should be, I should be walking her speed or not. Make sure that I'm kind of keeping the quote unquote intensity up to something that is actually light, not moving. So I would say increase the intensity on your steps and then try to get your rest periods down. If that doesn't do it, then I think actually having 2 to 3 formal cardio sessions where you do, say, 20 minutes on a low impact modality, where you are going to the point where the talk test would be something you would fail. I think you'd be good.
Yeah, and for clarity, that just means it would be because you're exerting and breathing hard, it would be difficult for you to hold a normal conversation. That it's like an intensity indicator.
Correct.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you know, with this kind of situation, I agree. Take a look at your rest times. Try walking more briskly, see if that moves the needle. But yeah, I was gonna say, if you are finding that those kinds of sets are fatiguing you in a meaningful way, I don't think you're gonna regret adding one or two cardio sessions to just see how it goes, right? And so, what I would say, spend 20 minutes doing whatever feels least tedious, So if that means, like, I used to really enjoy, for whatever reason, a simple hit protocol, which was just put the treadmill on a high speed, run for a minute pretty fast, and then chill for a minute. Do that 10 times. You have a 19-minute workout that is actually pretty substantial. But other people will say, "Oh, just get on a bike for 20 minutes," or get a jog or similar intensity on the elliptical for 20 minutes. But yeah, throw two of those into your weekly schedule wherever it's least cumbersome, preferably not immediately before a workout, but even still, with that type of cardio session, you'll live. But yeah, it's probably not preferable to put it right before a workout or a weight training workout. But yeah, I think even just two of those can, I think, go a very long way
Mm-hmm.
for someone who doesn't spend a lot of time in the week actually getting their heart rate up and getting some of those cardiovascular, cardiorespiratory adaptations. So I think that would be kind of a prudent step. And I think it's unlikely that you would need much more than that, to kind of meet what we're talking about in terms of, adaptations and kind of building up that fitness level. And again, it's hard to imagine a scenario where you would regret putting those in there, aside from the fact that maybe it's kind of just taking your medicine, right? Maybe I don't love it, but, you got to eat your broccoli, even though it's not the tastiest thing on your plate sometimes. But Helms, I was kind of chuckling as you were talking about walking with your wife and walking speed. It reminded me, when I was applying to grad schools, I was being led on a tour of an exercise physiology building where all the lab spaces were, in classrooms and offices and things like that. And it was really weird because I was going into it. I was kind of dieting down a little bit, but I wasn't like full blown into prep yet. And I was like, man, I am struggling on this walking tour. And I was like, this is very strange. I was quite fit, like, a high VO2 max, pretty lean, training very regularly. Um, and I was just weirded out by it. I was like, what is happening? I was like wondering if something was wrong with me. Cause yeah, I just couldn't keep up. And I learned many, many, many months later that the individual who was leading the tour actually used to be like an elite race walker. So they actually
Ah,
did walking races, and they were built for it. They basically were a very good marathoner who was kind of like, the story as I have coded it to memory, which may or may not be true, was that they were very good at marathons, but someone said, with your build, you must be a race walker. Like, you have to do this. And so the reason it was so jarring and surprising was because it was effortless. Like, this guy was built to be an elite, shockingly fast walker without exerting any effort or looking like he was straining whatsoever. So it like really gaslit me into believing that I was like maybe having some kind of cardiovascular issue, because I was like, I'm not an unfit person, but this person is leaving me in the dust and I'm like gasping for air here. So all that is to say, that's irrelevant, but be careful of who you walk with. Don't walk with fast people; it'll make you feel bad. But yeah, I think definitely, I think it's good that people kind of have this goal of saying like, yes, I'm mostly focused on getting big, bodybuilding, but I think the idea of having that kind of base level of fitness of saying I should be able to do these supersets and not feel like I'm like totally gassed. I think that's a good thing for just overall fitness, and I think it's good when we shy away from getting too hyper specialized in any particular aspect of our fitness, and we kind of remember that there's that baseline level of fitness that just kind of correlates with everything good in terms of kind of long-term health and wellness outcomes. So good on you, reader, listener, for calling in with this question. And we hope that some of this advice may serve to be useful for you. So keep us updated. Let us know.
Can I soapbox just for a second to close this out?
Absolutely.
The discussion of fatigue is actually pretty important right now, because of the what is currently perceived as the science based way of approaching hypertrophy training at the moment, which is anything but science based. There's no scientists involved in these conversations, and there's not even necessarily experienced coaches or people who've been lifting weights for more than 3 or 4 years. And it is heavily focused on fatigue being the main bottleneck to growth, heavily influenced by HIT and certain models and mechanisms of hypertrophy, which uh, go right back to what we talked about, overly simplistic heuristics. And the kind of narratives around it are that fatigue is something that you really want to try to avoid, to the point where the overload stimulus is going down to the point where I think it would actually minimal after the novice stage. Like a common messaging of, if you need any more than 4 to 8 hard sets, don't go past a 2 RIR, and then train that muscle group again, but not any more than every 2 to 3 days. Use stable equipment and make sure you be seated, chest supported. Don't want to fatigue the lumbar. It shouldn't be full body. And it's at the point now where I think your average powerlifting program would probably generate twice the hypertrophy of a quote unquote science based like bodybuilding program that is out there, because the volume's too low. The proximity to failure for that volume is kind of low. And there are just very few opportunities for new lifters to experience what their limits are, to know how to push anywhere near them, because they're worried about fatigue. And it's all under the guise of being science based, which is pretty wild. And I honestly think that bodybuilding is almost as much as CrossFit, but maybe more so if you think about it holistically and you let it bleed into your like social life and nutrition habits, is this sport of incurring massive amounts of fatigue, recovering from it, and persevering through it. Um, and to have these people who are thinking that they're taking on the best evidence-based bodybuilding approach, but really what they're doing is they're taking like basically Mike Mentzer's protocol, but going on, but I'm not going to train to failure. It's like you've removed the hard, and that's probably not going to get you there. And then we layer it on top of 2025, where the average person in the West, especially, is getting 4 to 5 thousand steps, and just generally not very active. And I'm like, you're avoiding the actual exercise benefits to the quote unquote exercise you're doing. You've minimized the hypertrophy. The good news is you have accurately identified that you're trying to minimize fatigue, and you've gotten the least amount of fatigue of it as possible. Recovery will not be an issue. You are good to go from a fatigue management perspective, forgetting that fatigue comes from overload. So yes, you have managed your fatigue by generating none through barely doing something that I would call training. Soapbox away.
No,
Finished.
I mean, I'm not going to pile on too much because it will become a fruitless endeavor. But I have noticed, Helms, now that I teach a weight training course, I actually teach a couple different ones of a couple different experience levels. And when I first kind of got back into the classroom, especially in a weight training oriented course, I assumed that the people who came in with a lot of prior knowledge and would tell me on the first day, like, oh man, I'm watching all this like fitness YouTube stuff. Like, I'm on Instagram, I'm on TikTok all the time, just soaking it up. I thought that that would kind of be a predictor of like these folks are gonna just get in here and go nuts. Like these guys are gonna be training like animals. And what I have found is a lot of the folks right now who are most tapped into the online social media discourse of training, they come to me on day one and they say, "Man, I basically took this course because I've been trying everything and I'm just not getting the kind of gains I want to get." And then I watch them train for 15 weeks and I have to kind of have that talk with them and I say, "You don't train hard, dude. Like I know that this goes against everything you're soaking up on the internet, but I'm telling you, you're not doing enough." And every person that seems to be telling you you're doing too much or you're doing enough the wrong way, but you just need. And what I always tell them, Helms, is my experience is I used to always like train at a gym whenever I would travel. So I'd go to the beach with my family, down on the coast, and I'd find a little gym by the beach. Brother, you walk into a YMCA gym at any coastal town, you're going to find a 55-year-old man who spends about 3 hours a day wearing a shirt tops, only when he has to. He's going to be extremely tan, skin of leather, and he's going to be jacked. And if you start to ask that man questions about training and nutrition, he is going to rightly say protein matters, but he's going to have wildly insane theories about protein, about why he eats fish but not beef, beef but not chicken, like all sorts of wacky stuff. You need this much per meal. No, you don't, but that's fine. Wacky ideas about nutrition, wacky ideas about training, but this dude, you gotta keep him out of the gym, right? He goes in there seven
Yep.
days a week. He goes in there and does hard things for 75 minutes and walks out sweating. He walked in not sweating. And you do that over and over and over and over. You end up being that jacked 55-year-old guy. But I'm getting so many folks that are in their athletic prime, and it's not that I refuse to believe that they are unwilling to work hard. I believe that they've been convinced they shouldn't. And
100%.
I think that that is criminal. And I can't tell you the number of folks who come into my class thinking I'm going to give them the secret key to unlock it. It's like, oh, you've been doing sets of 8. You never do more than 7. What are you thinking? Like, but it usually ends up being like, brother, I need you to do literally twice what you're doing and much harder. And like,
Mm-hmm.
do it for 12 months and come back. You're going to be much bigger. You're going to be much stronger. You are going to have no there's going to be no downside to this. And you're going to probably find that your training, even though it's harder, is less boring. Because man, I see people in the university, and listen, we're at a very selective university. The kids that come in here are very smart, which means they often overthink everything. They outthink the room, no matter what room they're in. Right? They're very analytical people, and so I think they do get drawn to these like very complex explanations of how this stuff is supposed to work. And man, I see a lot of people that are training with the kind of latest hot idea of whatever's popular and allegedly science based, although it's rarely actually based on science. But I don't see a lot of, I'm not saying none, but I don't see a lot of people who just get in there and train like an animal. You know what I mean? And everyone I know who's gotten big basically had that like 5 to 7 year period at least at the beginning where they just trained like an animal. And then they said, I wonder if I could do this smarter. After
Yeah.
5 or 7 years of figuring out what is the limit, how close can I get, what's the benefit of getting close, what's the downside of going too far, you start to figure out what is a very, very, very hard training session that is actually productive look like, what does a hard but productive training program look like, and then you start agonizing over these details. And I think so many young people these days are completely inverting it. And we are, Helms, having that conversation about the errors that the young people are making, and now that we're both ancient.
That's no, no, no. That's what I want to head off at the pass because this is not something that's been accumulating. This is a weird phenomenon that I have only noticed in at most the last 3 years.
Yeah.
I don't remember having this conversation when I was 40, right? And I get it. I'm a bodybuilder. You're a wrestler and an ex bodybuilder. I'm 42. You are spiritually 76. And it could be very easy, the Erics or the old men yelling at the clouds. But no, literally 2.5 years ago, this wasn't a thing. And it has become a thing, and it's kind of happened all of a sudden. And I've got a lot of people in their early 20s who that's just the current content. And I'm like, no, 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 no. Like this is bonkers. Like you guys are the current trend, and I know it will go away because honestly, you're just gonna stop making gains after 6 months.
Yeah,
Like you're
it is true.
the, like seriously,
Yeah.
like 4 sets at what you think is a 2 RIR for someone who's never trained at a 0 RIR is 2 sets at a 5 RIR, which is gonna after 6 months just be a warm up set, right? So the like it'll solve itself, but at great cost and effort and time and curiosity and frustration on your behalf. And I just don't want to see that happen. That's why I'm kind of like, hold the phone. This is not just me being old and being out of touch with the current generation or blaming this generation. I think if you were 35 and an engineer and you decided to start training, you would run into the same problem.
Yeah.
So yeah, just to
And
kind
and
of
again,
head that critique off.
it's I do not believe it's a lack of work ethic or a refusal
No.
to put in that sweat equity, so to speak. I just think a lot of people are being convinced that they ought not do it, that they should not be putting in that kind of intensity and volume. And man, I just, yeah, it's a shame because I think a lot of times that was kind of a good way to really let your passion for lifting manifest, saying I'm going to get in there and do a lot of
Hmm.
stuff and have fun and walk out of the gym tired. And I think a lot of times the people that love training, that's what made them fall in love with it. You know what I mean? And to see folks that are depriving themselves that experience at their own expense, not making as good of gains. And frankly, man, I look at the way that some people are, particularly like relatively young people, like we're talking about, and relatively like smart and well educated people. Man, it just looks boring. Like if that was the way I
Yep.
trained my first couple of years, I don't think I would have kept doing it. It just looks like a big
Yeah.
snooze fest, honestly. So yeah,
Yep.
hopefully,
And
this, like you said, will kind of sort itself out, and people will get back to. Man, it's such a weird tangent. I think you'll be okay with this. I'm gonna talk college football for a
let's
second.
go.
Okay.
Okay. I'm open to seeing, but I'm gonna tell you at the end if I was okay with it or not.
Okay, so
All
there's
right.
a documentary on Netflix about I think it's called Swamp Kings. It's about Urban Meyer's tenure as the head coach, University of Florida football, and they had a lot of training footage in this very short kind of like documentary series, and there was a lot of time spent not talking about how we had top of the line sports science and we were measuring GPS and we were measuring this and that and the other thing. They said, brother, we walked in there and we broke these kids. And you could argue about whether it was the most compassionate or empathetic way to train people, but man, they would go in, they'd have their normal training session, then they have the midnight extra session where they literally go in at midnight and make it like a party in the gym, and they are pushing. I mean, failure was 7 reps ago. You know what I mean? Just forced reps and forced reps, and after the forced reps are over, the heavy eccentrics. Like, I mean, just going so far beyond failure, people beating the crap out of themselves in the gym. And then you look at them on Saturdays and they were enormous and intimidating and physical. And they happen to be the best team in the country. And man, like, yeah, I think people forget that that's what training kind of started as for a lot of people, and where a lot of people made the majority of their gains. And it's not to say you train that way forever, but I think you would actually enjoy, Helms, if you kind of saw those bits of that documentary where they're in the gym and just pushing him. It was kind of like, what was that Dorian Yates, like blood and guts meets high volume
Blood and guts.
training meets college football. And yeah, it's I think the more that people try to outsmart the process, it's really to their own detriment, unfortunately. And like you said, I think my concern is this, Helms. My concern is that in terms of like an overall content trend, I agree. I think it's gonna flame out because it kind of has to. My concern is for people who are just getting into lifting during this weird time that we're experiencing, and that's how they start training, are they still going to be in it when the tide
Mm,
turns?
yeah.
Because I think a lot of them are just frustrated from not making gains, really quite bored, and I can't blame them. And that's my biggest concern is just what kind of attrition are we going to see of people who are going to miss out on the good stuff because they got roped into this, and it's just not very fruitful and it's not very fun.
So one, I was good with the tangent. It sounds like it's a lot about the S&C training for football and getting huge and jacked and training past failure, so you get a pass. Two, I 100% agree. You don't have to be the person who loves the semi-masochistic elements of training, but philosophically, I agree with the idea of trying to be as efficient as possible in getting the most amount of stimulus you can with the least amount of fatigue. But when that's inverted and you actually don't understand the mechanisms of hypertrophy, and you think that managing fatigue is all you need to do, and then the stimulus will just be there, rather than the fatigue being a consequence of the stimulus, and a more targeted stimulus producing still but getting more out of it, that then you can optimize the area of the curve, then you're missing out because see if I can do more volume. I manage fatigue so if I can see if I can do more long muscle length training. I manage fatigue so I can see if I can get away with more sets closer to a zero RIR, true failure, right? I manage time to see if I can get more volume in and under the time constraints I have. I am trying to see how much can I get away with doing that is effective and not bottlenecked by fatigue. So I'm looking at both sides of the equation because they're intrinsically linked. And I feel like this central focus on fatigue, it subverts that. And like you said, it takes, at the very least, even if you're someone who is purely focused on the bottom line and you just want results, you're not going to get those. But if you're someone who actually enjoys the hard work and the challenge and the experience of progressive overload, you're going to have a little bit of that at the very, very start. And then you won't actually be training hard enough to get some of that endorphin feedback and the actual psychological benefit of seeing I worked hard at something, it challenged me, and I was better for it, right? And that is ultimately what leads to long-term adherence and falling in love with this. It's not just masochism or hard work for hard work's sake or us doing virtue signaling around being the hardest worker in the room. We're not being Lane Norton circa 2007. I love you, buddy. It is for a purpose. I quite literally think that it is not about how hard you work. It is about doing the work necessary to get the outcome you want, which will inevitably be hard.
Yeah, I mean it's at the end of the day, it's you got if you get really wrapped up in this idea of I'm doing this for the results, not the process. I want to streamline the process as much as I can. Like again, you said it a million times. I totally agree. It makes sense to want to get the most bang for your buck, but when your focus becomes on when you start to really focus on it's almost like people are there like watering their plants. Like, I mean, I got to do it if I want them to grow, right? But I don't want to be here watering the plants. It's boring as hell. I gladly automate it if I could. It's when you start to
And,
say
and
that,
and I forgot to buy a seed.
yeah,
Like
exactly, yeah.
I'm watering dirt and providing sunlight, but the seed is not there.
Yeah, but it
Yeah,
becomes a chore. It becomes the whole like 4 hour
it does.
work week. Why do you want the 4 hour work week? Because I don't want to be working. So why when you dig deeper and it's like, well, why do you want this hyper optimized ultra efficient training program? If it's because you're very busy and you want the most bang for your buck given your time constraints, I totally get it. But if the answer is because who wants to be training? It's like, well, I mean,
Yeah,
we do. Like that's
yeah. Then just wait 5 years. They're going to develop a myostatin inhibitor, and you don't even have to go to the gym.
yeah.
Like
So
we're not
again,
far off.
it, it's one of those things where the psychology of it, like you're alluding to, is big, and it's like, why are we doing all this? And if the answer is because, like,
Hmm.
at the end of the day, who wants to be breaking a sweat and being there training? Like that's just a huge divide. It's a huge disconnect between what has always been, to name drop, the iron culture. People train because they like to train
Yes.
and they like what it brings them, and they like that reinforcement of I work hard, Challenges arise, I push through them. I'm better for it. That increases my confidence, my sense of self worth. I'm invested in in this behavior or invested in this endeavor. It's this whole mechanism, and I'm not convinced you can really play it out successfully in the long term without that kind of feedback process. At least for the average person, because we've all seen people who have great genetics. They train for a sport because they have to. They get huge. They don't train when they're 48. They train for literally the entirety of their uh, athletic career, and they say, I guess I'll do this because I have to. Let's try to get this over with. But they don't develop that love for it, and that's fine. You don't have to, but yeah, when you have people who are lifting hobbyists, who I used to talk to a lot of retired NFL players because of some research we were doing, and I would say, when's the last time you trained? And they'd say, the day I retired. They're like, what? Why would I train like if I don't
I'm not
have
playing
to?
football. That's what I trained for.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so yeah, when it becomes this very deliberate, purely outcome
Transactional.
focused, transactional thing, and you're kind of like, what's the least I can do, and can we please get this over with? And I'm committed to kind of not really allowing myself to enjoy this process. Ugh. I just, if people like doing it that way, that's fine. But I just, it doesn't resonate with me. I struggle to see it.
If people like doing it that way, it is not fine. They're bad people, and I will. And you're not, and get out. This is iron culture.
It is, honestly, it is tough to be embraced by the iron culture. You raise a good point. We may have to do some kind of pruning, so to speak. We may have to show some people the door.
I just told them get out,
Yeah,
and I hope they listen.
yeah. All right, Helms. I think that does it for tonight. Now we're just ranting at each other in violent agreement. So let's wrap it up here. Once again, best of luck as you compete in Worlds next week. We are going to have a pre-recorded episode next week, but it'll drop right around the same time. So make sure you keep your eyes open for that on YouTube on Monday, and then it'll be up on podcast platforms a few days after, as is typical. I want to thank everyone so much for joining us tonight for this episode of Iron Culture. Have a fantastic week, and we will see you, or I will see you. Someone, actually, I forget which episode I'm going to run. Either me or Helms will see you in 7 days.